World War I, 1914 to 1918. We're going to be getting started with this lecture right now, so make sure you take complete notes. So, causes of World War I. There's several of them. Again, this dates back to the world history a little bit. You have, basically the assassination of Franz Ferdinand is one of them. You have the grabbing of territories and colonization of European powers. You have the buildup of militarism. And of course, you have slicing the pie with, of course, nationalism. And really, what really affects it was this extreme alliances that were built up during this time period, where you had Central and Axis powers, or Central and Allied powers, with the Central powers being Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Ottoman Empire, and the Allied powers being in the green, with England, Russia, and France being the big three. So then we have these causes of World War I. So at the start of World War I, America and Woodrow Wilson claimed neutrality. We want to remain basically out of this war, really to benefit economically, preferably. We do cut off economic ties to the Central Powers, but we do keep retaining economic ties to England and France. This is where the sinking of Lusitania will come in. It will be sunk in 1915. There will be about 128 American deaths on this. And we decide not to have this bring us into war. We do demand Germany stop submarine warfare on American ships. They do agree, but a couple weeks after this agreement, the Germans will sink the Sussex. And again, Wilson still deems neutrality more important than getting back at German attacking American vessels and or passengers. With Lusitania and sinking. And of course, the German U-boat was this, not a brand new invention, but it was first war. It was extremely utilized as a naval weapon. So in the election of 1916, Wilson basically declares that he kept us out of war, and so therefore that was one of his slogans. He'll run against the Republican Charles Evans, and he'll win not very easily. Electoral vote-wise, pretty decently. But popular vote-wise, again, he only gains about 42% of the popular vote, just like the last election. So he's a very divided president in both of his victories. Eventually, Americans can get pulled into this great war. Germans going to start completing like unrestricted warfare on American ships headed in Britain. That's one cause. Another cause is the Zimmermann telegram, where the German foreign minister is going to request Mexico's alliance to attack America. And probably the third and the biggest cause is the Russian Revolution. This Bolshevik revolution that Lenin and the Bolsheviks will push the czars and overthrow them is going to bring basically Russia out of the war, take Russia out of the war. Once that happens, Germany could then basically take its troops from the Eastern Front and then start using those troops on the West. At that point, America has almost no ability not to join the war because of the dire need. You see here the cartoon of the German trying to carve to Mexico in some of the old territory that we got through the Mexican-American War. And of course, the Russian Revolution over the Bolshevik. And this was a really true scare to America as well. And the thought was that could a socialist revolution happen in America? So there's a lot of scare about the rising American Socialist Party that was going on, the rising labor movement that was going on in America. And this was also, if it could happen in a country like Russia, could it happen in America as well? But there was some fears of that with Lenin and the new Marxist revolution that he was pushing. So eventually America will enter the war on April 6, 1918. we basically start really pushing to end unrestricted warfare to make sure that submarines aren't blowing up naval vessels and troops being sent over there. We also start a draft, the Selective Service Act, where basically military draft, where about 3 million men will be drafted into the war. There will be some people that are going to basically fight this in many cases because they think that that sort of goes against their 13th, 14th Amendment rights of servitude. But we do see also women and also African Americans enlist in the war as well, with women being non-combat roles and African Americans enlisting but basically forced into non-combat roles because of segregation. As we see lots of propaganda to get kids to register to vote, registered for the military draft. So in the war, we had brand new types of warfare and technology that's going to really make this a very different and more extreme war than wars past. You have, of course, the use of machine guns, the use of poisonous mustard gas or cyanide gas. For the first time, tanks being used really in any major war. Flamethrowers being used in the trenches. And of course, airplanes being used for the first time in a wartime setting as well. They weren't going to have a huge part of this war, but their use will sort of spur the craze of airplanes that's going to take place in the 1920s. Grenades are going to be used heavily in this war. So are basically battleships or dreadnoughts. And trench warfare is going to be a big part of what's going on in this war. Where a lot of the battles are going to be fought on the Western Front. With horrible, horrible conditions. Many men dying from diseases, from trench foot, and of course the spread of Spanish flu. Wiping out a huge number of Americans and other nationalities. And there's a picture of the trench foot. Okay, so we join, and pretty much we quickly, with our added help and resources in this war, we quickly are able to defeat the Germans. Pretty quickly after we do join the war. We do have lots of deaths as well, but again, pretty quickly. The Germans will basically surrender on November 11th, 1918, which will be Armistice Day. Eventually, that'll be renamed to Veterans Day. And we're partying in the streets because of that. Death toll is huge. This is overall about 20 million dead with a huge rate of civilians. For Americans, we have about 112,000 deaths. Again, about half of that due to that Spanish flu. You see there's deaths by country. Okay, so what was going on in American socially, politically, and economically on our home front during the war? And that's what usually was tested on, probably in the most highest capacity. So one is financing the war. To pay for the war, it's going to cost lots of money. Typically during wars, during World War I, World War II, we're going to use something called war bonds, or liberty bonds, liberty loans, war loans, victory loans, victory bonds. And what this is basically a government bond that citizens will pay for to fund the war. What the allure is that the citizens will get their money back after the war with interest rates. And so we see huge amounts of war bonds sold, and of course increasing taxes will take care of the rest of it. Again, a lot of propaganda to get people to do their part. If you can't fight in the war, at least to help financially in the war. The government's going to change also, take a lot of control. This is a big thing to note, is that during wars we see governments a lot take more control of the economy and take more like a regulation of the rights and economy as well. So these war boards is the government taking control of a section of the economy. for Energy Board, Food Board, War Industries Board, all basically taking control of one part of our society. Energy Board taking control of the nation's energy, the Food Board taking care of rationing and making sure that our troops have enough food, but also the people at home have enough food. And the War Industries Board was basically taking charge of converting civilian factories into war factories. There was quite a bit of corruptions and inefficiencies to these boards, and we'll sort of rectify and correct a lot of those problems for the next war we have in World War II. Energy Board also came up with daylight savings time to try to save fuel to by keeping the lights or pushing the time back in the springtime. The War Industry Board is again converting civilian factories to war factories. And of course, with so many men drafted and volunteering, we're going to see many women sort of joining the ranks of factories to help produce Americans' war goods. We also see African Americans as well in that. Also, the promotion of Victory Gardens is the Food Board. So basically, getting people to grow their own gardens in their home was a big part of trying to increase the capacity and increase the amount of production of food we have. There was different days like Weekless Wednesdays and Meatless Mondays to help promote eating less food on certain days. And also during the war, the National War Labor Board was created to sort of help calm down any strikes or any labor disagreements. And for the most part, the idea was that workers would refuse to strike for future gains later on. One case of problems was the Ludlow Massacre, where there were strikers that were killed in a mine strike in Colorado. To meet a lot of these new demands for labor, we saw many African Americans starting to migrate northwards to fill a lot of these factory jobs roles, and also to escape from Jim Crow South. We see this massive migration, basically from the 1910s all the way through the 1930s of African Americans moving northwards. It will increase some racial tensions in the north, and we will see some race riots that erupt in the north by the end of the 19-teens because of this. So here, the massive increase of population of African Americans in these northern cities. And we'll see a second wave of migration from African Americans in World War II as well. And to sell the war effort, we do see the government basically creating this propaganda agency called the Creel Commission, headed by George Creel, and the whole point was to get American people to support the war effort and the government. And of course, during war, we do see the government take more control. It also means they are going to maybe sometimes do things that infringe on people's rights. The Espionage and the Sedition Act both did that. The Espionage Act of 1917 created it basically to stop spying or sabotage. And what it basically did, it empowered the post office to ban seditious materials. Well, one thing that did come up during this time period is that we have Charles Schneck, who basically was a person who was against the war, and he really was against the draft, especially. So he basically sent pamphlets through the mail to question or criticize the draft. By doing that, he was breaking the law. So the government sued him and arrested him, and basically he sued the government for that arrest. During this 1919 Supreme Court case, the court ruled that during times of war, the United States can take away or infringe on people's rights if there's a clear and present danger. The example that they used was you can't always your free speech cannot always be universally accepted if that speech could put people in danger. And the example they use is like screaming fire in a crowded movie theater. The next year, they did pass the Sedition Act to basically strengthen the Espionage Act. And what that did is make it illegal to publicly express any opposition to war. They were really targeting these groups that were sort of these un-American, anti-American groups of socialists or anarchists, extreme labor unions of the IWW example. Actually, presidential candidate Eugene Debs was jailed for his anti-war sentiment in this time period as well. When we see this cartoon, we see Uncle Sam trying to hit the fly off his forehead with a sledgehammer. And it says, swap the fly, but use common sense, meaning that, well, maybe we don't like communists, which is the fly's red, but use common sense. So maybe the sedition bill was not the best tactic to do this. You also have this cartoon here, the big snake. This is a much more harsher viewpoint of the sedition legislation. And of course, there was anti-German sentiment in this time period. We do see campaigns to basically get rid of German culture, to Americanify German words. You see a list of words that were basically Americanified because of that. You know, a hamburger, a Liberty sandwich, or Liberty steak, for example. And the peace treaty. So eventually the war will be over. Wilson's going to push for 14 points. This idealistic treaty that has all these different points to create a better world, pretty much. You know, freedom of seas, in alliances, open trade barriers. Big part of this was his peace treaty. The Big Four is going to basically meet in Europe to basically come up with a treaty. They're going to basically blame France, or maybe in France, they're going to blame Germany for the cause of the war. They're going to make Germany pay huge amounts of reparations to the victors, to England, to France, for example. And this treaty also redraws Europe, basically breaking up the German Empire and also breaking up the Soviet or the Russian Empire and making countries that are sovereign too. So we see here, this was Europe prior to World War II, World War I. And here's the breakup of Europe. You see Germany gets broken up, but also you see Russia getting broke up into Poland and Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Ukraine, Romania. You see a big taking away of the Russian Empire as well. And a big part of the peace treaty, or what Wilson wanted, was a League of Nations, this universal body that was going to be used as a peacekeeping body for Europe to come. However, though, Congress was very much not into it. You see the cartoon here. Congress is very much not wanting to get in part of the League of Nations. And that made me think that this was idealistic pipe dream of Wilson's. And again, here you see Henry Cabot Lodge. He was a anti-leaguer. He was a Democrat. He was a Republican against Wilson. And he basically was able to take America out of much of the peace treaty and make, especially the League of Nations. There's a lot of dispute. Eventually, the League was rejected, and Wilson is going to basically be going on this huge tour to promote this peace treaty in the League of Nations. He will get a stroke on this tour that will basically hinder the rest of his year and a half in office. Okay, society in turmoil during and right after the war. And so one big thing was during the war, we do have a huge Spanish flu pandemic that came from America. It spread throughout the trenches and it basically just devastated American communities and world communities worldwide. Tens of millions of deaths resulted from the Spanish flu. We also see industry and labor happen. Post-war, after the war, we see this major recession in America. We see lots of people getting fired. We see so many men come back from the war wanting jobs. We see our economy basically collapse, especially our farm industry as well. And so we see rapid inflation. And of course, when the economy goes bad, we do see lots of strikes. So we see a huge wave of industry strikes with the Seattle General Strike and the steelworkers strike being the two really big ones. And of course, this is going to cause a lot of commotion, a lot of problems with the American economy, and also with how Americans view strikers, union laborers, and workers. And of course, we see the IWW, this really extreme union, sort of trying to kill capitalism with this industrial unionization. And what is saying this capitalism is really bad? It promotes poverty, child labor, it pushes for war, wage slavery, all these horrible things. We also see the Boston police go on strike as well. And the governor, Calvin Coolidge, forces the police back to work or they'll be fired. So many actually do get fired on this. Eventually, the governor has to call the National Guard to protect Boston because huge looting happened when the police did go on strike. So again, we see that the society was definitely up in arms and definitely had a lot of turmoil going on. We also have basically huge new wave of black activism that spurred into violence. We do see David Du Bois really coming to prominence. Really, he starts the excuse me, the Bankston crisis to push for black activism. We also have the Chicago race riots. This actually happened after a black boy was killed at a beach. And at that beach, we do see the police target black kids and arrest some of the black kids at the beach, not the white kids who murdered that black boy. And so we see a huge race riots erupt over Chicago. These race riots will spread to lots of other cities. It just sort of shows you the tension that African Americans in the North still face lots of problems, and there's a lot of racial tensions in the North as well. Some black advocates were pushing for black isolationism, basically black nationalism. And basically the best way to do that was to put African Americans back to Africa. So this whole big push to the only where that African Americans would truly be free was in a home where there was not whites who were leading the government. It really failed. Really nothing really happened. And Marcus Garvey actually sort of was led into scandal during this time as well. You also have this really huge topic called the Red Scare. This Red Scare was the scare of communism, this fear of anarchy or socialism in America. And it was spurred because of this Bolshevik revolution that was going on. And there was actually several things that did happen this time period that caused concern. There was these anarchist attacks that did sort of spread throughout the late 1919. Some bombs went off down by Wall Street. Some bombs were sent to the Attorney General's house and went off. And a lot of people thought that these strikers, these socialists, were a big cause of this. And so there was this big sort of pit against union workers and socialization and strikers and communists. So the Attorney General basically set up this FBI, the Special Forces Unit, to seek out communists, target them, illegally raid them. And we do see basically several people getting arrested. This is called the Palmer Raids. And several hundred were actually sent back to Europe. And we actually had a creation of the ACLU that was in charge of maybe a group that came to prominence to basically defend the people that were accused of socialism or anarchy for really no evidence besides their opinions. And so this American Civil Liberties Union is a legal group that will fight for people's rights. And we also have the Sacco-Vanzetti trial. This again just sort of states and shows you the fear of the foreigner, the fear of the immigrant, the fear of the anarchist, the person that was like against America in some ways. These are two people that were accused of murder. Eventually, it was got out that they didn't do anything wrong later on, back in the 80s, the 1980s. But even though the ACLU will defend them, they will be put to death by electrocution, again, for crimes that were very loosely tied to them. And eventually, we're going to see this return to normalcy, where basically Warren Harding is going to run with the campaign against the Democrat because Wilson basically was a very weak and fragile man. He didn't really have a good ability to campaign for Cox. And Warren Hard's going to run on this return to normalcy, return away from progressivism, back to Republican rule, away from war, away from strikes, away from racial riots. He's going to win. Okay, well, make sure you ask some questions during class about this. And then also we're going to do this SAQ. So you're going to be doing this SAQ for homework. Basically explain one example of the steps America government took to mobilize American people or the economy for World War I. Explain one example of government repression of civil liberties in America during World War I. And explain one example of a government repression of civil liberties in America right after World War I. Okay, so that's your homework for tonight. And then we'll look at this tomorrow during class. Have a great night, guys.